Hello and welcome everyone. After having read some of the most eminent Enlightenment thinkers who believe in the power of rationality and put the universal individual at the center of their notions of morality, rights, and politics, we will today read a text by someone who can be considered an anti-Enlightenment thinker. Even though Burke's position is conservative, his anti-Enlightenment attitude makes him one of the more radical thinkers we will read throughout this course. Where Marx is in many regards just a footnote to Enlightenment, philosophically speaking, with some Hegelian influences, and radical politically, Burke in some regards is his mirror image. So he argues against the Enlightenment period by a rather sophisticated philosophical enterprise and is radical in that regard, even though some of the policies he will represent, most of you will consider conventional. So next to Burke, I asked you to read a text by Michael Oakeshott. The reason for this is that he is more of a standard or ordinary political philosopher in our sense of the word. It must be noted in this regard that Burke was an especially practical man, who is actually one of the few authors we've read to actually have held political office. Oakeshott is the more classical philosopher, and reading him can therefore be useful to come to grasp with some of the underlying philosophy in Burke's text. So it's basically a distinction between a practical versus a slightly more theoretical focus. This already becomes apparent in the titles of the two different works I asked you to read. Where Burke's work is called Reflections on the French Revolution, which is clearly practical in focus, Oakeshott's book is called Rationalism in Politics, so more on the theoretical side. And as we have done in other lectures, like we'll be doing today, we will focus on understanding Burke by the heuristics of a specific quote. So we'll start with the quote, move through specific sections of his argument, and then come back to the quote to see how to understand it. The quote that I selected from Burke, you can find on page 609, is that France has bought undisguised calamities at a higher price than any nation has purchased the most unequivalent blessings. France has bought poverty by crime. France has not sacrificed her virtue to her interest, but she has abandoned her interest so that she may prostitute her virtue. I hope this quote immediately raises the following question. Why is Burke so negative about the French Revolution? As normally, the French Revolution is seen as a great advancement in our political history. People today still believe and occasionally shout out liberté, fraternité, et égalité. So the first step to understanding why Burke is so critical of this French Revolution has to do with his attitude towards politics. Note that I here use the word attitude instead of the word theory that we use to discuss most other people's or other writers' philosophy. The reason for this is that Burke does not have a consistent or concrete theory of what politics is. He is actually opposed to fully theorizing the political. To understand why this is the case, it's instructive to have a look at the following passage. The science of constituting a commonwealth, or renovating it, or reforming it, is, like every other experimental science, not to be taught a priori, nor is it a short experience that can instruct us in that practical science, because the real effect of moral causes are not always immediate, but that which is in first instance prejudicial may be excellent in its remote operations, and its excellence may arise even from its ill effects it produces in the beginning. The reverse also happens, and very plausible schemes with very pleasing commensaries have often shamefully and lamentable conclusions. The science of government, being therefore so practical in itself and intended for such practical purposes, a matter which requires experience and even more experience than one can gain in his whole life, however sagacious and observing he may be. It is with infinite caution that any man ought to venture upon pulling down an edifice which has answered in any tolerable degree of ages the common purpose of society, or building it up again without having models and patterns of approved utility before his eyes. The important thing to notice is that knowledge of politics cannot be taught a priori. It is not something like math, wherein you can study the principles, learn from books, practice in notebooks, and then you become good at it. No, politics can only be understood experimentally. That is, by practicing and engaging in it. Nor is it easy to be good in politics, as immediate and remote effects of policies might be different. So, Burke is not a reactionary to the Enlightenment, but he's skeptic of it, which leads him to value tradition. The distrust of reason and what it can achieve in the context is the core of his conservatism. If we can't reason our way out of political problems, then Burke thinks whatever knowledge we have about the political is embedded in our traditions, which served us over centuries and have evolved in a glacial way. Our traditions, if you want, can be seen as a collection of best practices. So, the conservatist element in Burke stems from the basic meaning of the word to conserve. That is, to maintain the inherited systems of norms, practices, and beliefs in institutions that we reproduce while moving forward. The Burkean kind of conservatism is then very different from the libertarian conservatism, as we found in Nozick, and we also mentioned occasionally throughout this course, which is characterized by a specific anti-statist attitude. This conservatism, so the Burkean conservatism, isn't diametrically opposed to change or giving the state power. It means that we have to just tread with extreme caution when we are making changes to our political systems, as we cannot achieve theoretical certainty about whether we are doing the right thing. In this regard, the doctrine of change and the kind of conservatism that Burke proposes can be nicely summarized by Sir Robert Peel quote, saying that changing what you have in order to conserve what you can. This attitude towards politics is also reflected in Burke's idea of representation. In his speeches to the Electors of Bristol, you will find him saying, "Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays you instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. To deliver an opinion is the right of all men. That of the constituent is a weighty and respectable opinion, which a representative ought always to rejoice to hear, and which he ought always to most seriously consider. But authoritative instruction, mandates issued, which the member is bound to blindly and implicitly obey, to vote and to argue for, though contrary to the clearest conviction of his judgment and conscience, these are the things utterly unknown to the laws of this country, and which arise from a fundamental mistake of the whole order and tenor of our Constitution." So Burke here argues for a trustee model of political representation. In a trustee model of representation, the representative is not so much bound by the explicit views or wishes or commands of his constituents, but his role is not simply to communicate and act upon the interest as expressed by the constituent, which would be the delegate model of representation, but rather they pick the representative which they trust. And what do they trust in him? They trust his judgment and his skill in doing politics. This necessity of a representative to have a good sense of political judgment follows from this Burkean disposition towards politics, which is not something to be learned, but something to be empirically embedded in. In order to clarify this attitude to politics, rather than the theory of politics, it is instructive to have a look at the conservative disposition in Oakeshott. For this aim, we will contrast Oakeshott's conception of a rationalist and of a conservatist, focusing on the distinction between practical and theoretical knowledge. Oakeshott, in his essay on being a conservative, which is also in the book that I sent you, but you did not have to read. He says, to be conservative, then, is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbound, the near to the distant, sufficient to the present, and the convenient to the subburdened, present laughter to the utopian bliss. In the other essay, the one that you did have to read, on rationalism in politics, he defines the rationalist as follows. He is the enemy of authority, of prejudice, of mere tradition, customary or habitual. His mental attitude is one of skepticism and optimism. Skeptical because there's no opinion, no habit, no belief, nothing so firmly rooted or so widely held that he hesitates to question it and judge it by what he calls his reason. Optimistic because the rationalist never doubts the power of reason, when properly applied, to determine the worth of a thing, the truth of an opinion, or the property of an action. The rationalist can be viewed as a political problem solver or an engineer. When there is a problem in politics, that means that we haven't found the right theoretical way of examining it, and therefore we need to reject old theories and explanations or old ways of doing that until we've come up with the right one. It is therefore that the rationalist position is characterized by one of perfection and unity. As Oakeshott states, the two general characteristics of rationalist politics may be observed. They are the politics of perfection and they are the politics of uniformity. A problem must be counterfeit, and the rational solution of any problem is in its nature the perfect solution. There is no place in this scheme for a best in circumstances, only a place for the best, because the function of reason is precisely to surmount to these circumstances. And from this politics of perfection springs the politics of uniformity, a scheme which does not recognize circumstances that can have no place for variety. The conservative, however, does think that there is place in politics for the best given circumstance, and recognizes that politics is inherently messy. That is, he favors no one-size-all or perfect solution, and actually denies the possibility of this existing within politics. This is why he prefers the things that have been proven to work and cautiously builds further on this. This is why he prefers the actual over the possible, the near over the distant, etc., etc. In essence, what this difference boils down to is a difference in the relative valuation of practical knowledge and technical or theoretical knowledge. So, what exactly is this difference in valuation between the rationalist and the conservative? Well, in order to understand that, we need to make clear the distinction between practical and theoretical knowledge. For Oakeshott, technical knowledge is knowledge that's characterized by rules and formulas. On this he says, in many activities this technical knowledge is formulated into rules which are or may be deliberately learned, remembered, and, as we say, put into practice. But whether or not it is or has been precisely formulated, its chief characteristic is that it is susceptible to precise formulation, although special skill and insight may be required to give it that formulation. It is basically a kind of knowledge which you can get from textbooks, where practical knowledge, on the other hand, only exists in use and is not reflective, and unlike a technique, cannot be formulated in rules. This knowledge can be turned into a general heuristic or a habit, but it's not a precise rule. It's practice, not textbooks, where you can get this kind of knowledge. We won't get into an example, but if you're interested, Oakeshott provides a very nice illustration based on cooking on page 8 of the text I sent you. And furthermore, Oakeshott is of the opinion that any kind of action to be performed correctly requires both types of knowledge. So what's then the problem if one need both types of knowledge? Well, the problem is that the rationalists don't recognize practical knowledge as knowledge at all. And here I quote Oakeshott again. Now, as I understand it, rationalism is the assertion that what I call practical knowledge is not knowledge at all. The assertion that, properly speaking, there is no knowledge which is not technical knowledge. The rationalist holds that the only element of knowledge involved in any human activity is technical knowledge. And that what I have called practical knowledge is really only a sort of nescience which would be neglectable if it were not positively mischievous. The sovereignty of reason means the sovereignty of technique. While technical knowledge has an aura of truth to it, as it is expressible in texts and theories, the practical knowledge, which resists universal expression, is found in the practice itself, or the traditional way of doing things. And remember that it is this traditional way of doing things that rationalists are skeptic of, as it cannot be expressed in something that fits the form of a logical deduction, and therefore the mind or the ratio cannot work upon it. So practical knowledge does not produce certainty, and therefore it is closer to suspicion rather than knowledge for these rationalists. This, however, is a categorical mistake for Oakeshott, as we already said. Like Burke, Oakeshott maintains the position that politics is all about unforeseen circumstances, unanticipated results, and compromising. All of this is not possible when your idea of politics is mechanically applying principles to cases. Therefore, any reduction to only technical knowledge will always lead to mistakes, and the practical knowledge, the experience, being able to make judgment calls, doing the best given a circumstance, and dealing with non-textbook examples is exactly what is needed in politics. However, rather than recognizing this as a problem, the rationalists will double down on its position. Rather than admitting their mistakes, they will blame policy failures on tradition or people acting irrationally, leading to more and more radical reforms and more administrative politics, which will on its way destroy all the tacit practical knowledge embedded in tradition and practice. This recognition of tacit knowledge about politics and its importance is what's called the conservative disposition in Oakeshott, and is relatively similar to the Burkean attitude towards politics. Oakeshott's critique of rationalists should help us to then understand Burke's critique of French revolutionaries. The French Revolution is the exact opposite of the cautious attitude towards politics that both call for. It is this administratively and mechanical way of doing politics where you take an axiomatic principle, liberté, fraternité, and égalité, and shape politics only to that belief, destroying all the old institutions and hence the practical knowledge embedded in them. The French Revolution swatted away everything and started tabula rasa. For Oakeshott, it is a categorical mistake when it comes to knowledge, and for Burke, it's equally problematic, as not everything can be learned, and those destroyed conditions contained important political knowledge that was gathered over time, and no one, how sageous and observing he may be, can contain or learn everything which is relevant to the conduct of politics in one lifetime. So to put it bluntly, the danger of the situation was that the French people were not even smart enough to realize how dumb they were. Not smart enough to realize that they have released forces which they cannot control nor know the end of. This critique of the power of reason is one of the many anti-enlightenment elements we will find in Burke's thinking. Now, all these Enlightenment thinkers told us that there was something special about us humans. And in one way or another, forced our political institutions to give us some form of rights or to protect us from something. And most of these rights were proclaimed to be observable by reason or attainable by reason. So what idea about a right will somebody like Burke, who's an anti-Enlightenment thinker and rejects this sovereignty of reason, give us? So what does the Burkean concept of a right look like? On this topic, and I think it's a fairly dense topic, so we'll deal with a lot of quotes to see how his reasoning goes. We'll take a couple of quotes and then analyze them. We'll start easy, and then we'll get into a more nitty-gritty discussion. So the first quote, "You will observe that from Magna Carta to the Declaration of Right, it has always been the uniform policy of our Constitution to claim and assert our liberties as an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers and to be transmitted to our posterity, as an estate especially belonging to the people of this kingdom, without any reference whatever to any other more general or prior right. By this means, our Constitution preserves a unity in so great a diversity of its parts. We have an inheritable crown, an inheritable peerage, and a House of Commons, and the people inheriting privileges, franchises, and liberties from a long line of ancestors." The idea here is that the Constitution and rights are inherited, meaning that Englishmen have rights as Englishmen, and that there are no prior or recent rights, as you would find put forward by somebody like Locke, where in a state of nature we are all sovereign and that we derive our rights in civil society from transferring our natural rights to a civil government. So his idea of inherent rights is a second break of the Enlightenment tradition. The fact that these rights are inherited also makes them particular rights, because they are part of a particular tradition, in opposition to the kind of universal rights, which again you will find an example of in law. A question of universal rights, conceived in abstract terms, are unintelligible to someone like Burke. It is based on this why Burke was in favor of an American Revolution or Irish claims to home rule, because its own government, the British Crown, was violating the Irish and Americans' rights that they had as subjects of those English Crown. The English rights were being violated, where in the French case, somebody disposed with the whole tradition altogether, making him rejected. So now we know the form of rights in Burke. They are inherited and they are particular. But what is the substance of these rights? In short, it's a right to be constrained, rather than a right to be creative, as we find in the other accounts, or more negative accounts of freedom. So look at the following passage. "Far am I, denying in theory, full as far in my heart, from withholding in practice the real rights of man. In denying their false claims of right, I do not mean to injure those which are real, and are such as their pretended rights would totally destroy. If civil society be made for the advantage of man, all these advantages for which it is made become his right. It is an institute of beneficence, and law itself is only beneficence acting by rule. Men have a right to live by that rule. They have a right to do justice as between their fellows, whatever their fellows are in political function or in an ordinary occupation." What Burke claims in this passage is that there are real rights, those inherited particular rights, and false rights, the rights that ideologically motivated individuals, think of the revolutionaries in France, claim that people have. We should defend the real rights. And what shapes the content of these real rights is basically the benefits that society has given to the individual. So there is an acknowledgement that society exists for the betterment of our position, but since it's actually our current institutions that have proven to work, and our traditions that contain the relevant knowledge that can be conceived as a collection of best practices, it is that right which society gives us that are the rights we have as citizens. Denying us these rights for false rights is denying us the benefits of our society, as we don't know what will happen if we indeed were to radically overhaul the system. This idea can also be found in the next section. If civil society be the offspring of convention, that convention must be its law. The convention must limit and modify all descriptions of the constitution which are formed under it. Every sort of legislative, judicial, or executive power it creates. They can have no being in any other state of things, and how can any claim, under the convention of civil society, rights which do not so much as oppose its existence? Rights which are absolutely repugnant to it. One of the first motives to civil society, and which will become one of its fundamental rules, is that no man should be a judge in its own case. By this, each person has at once divested himself of the first fundamental right of uncovenanted man to judge for himself and to assert his own cause. He abdicates all rights to his own governor. He inclusively, in a great measure, abandons the right of self-defense, which is the first law of nature. Men cannot enjoy the rights of uncivil and the civil state together. That he may obtain justice, he gives up his right of determining what is in point most essential to him. That he may secure some liberties, he makes a surrender in trust of the whole of it. Not only does this section repeat the idea we previously laid out, but it also adds a dimension. It asserts that we cannot be judges in our own case. It also tells us that we cannot wish for things which run against the convention that gave rise to our rights, even that we have to give up our right to self-defense, so that we can have some shot at justice and liberty. The idea that there is one substantial aspect, the idea here is that one substantial aspect of our rights is that we have a right to be restrained, that our government might limit us on acting on some drives and desires. However, this passage might also be found confusing, because why does it mention natural rights? Weren't natural rights related to those doctrines that Burke opposes? Well, let us delve deeper into this. In another passage he says, government is not made in virtue of natural rights, which may and do exist in total independence of it, and exist in much greater clearness and a much greater degree of abstract perfection. But their abstract perfection is their practical defect. By having a right to everything, they want everything. Government is a contrivance of human wisdom, provided for human wants. Men have a right that these wants should be provided for by this wisdom. Among these wants is to be reckoned the want out of civil society of a sufficient restraints upon their passions. Society requires not only that passions of individuals should be subjected, but that even the mass and body, as well as the individuals, the inclination of men should frequently be thwarted, their will controlled, and their passions be brought into subjection. This can only be done by a power out of themselves, and not in an exercise of its function, subjected to that will and to those passions which it is in office to bridle and subdue. In this sense, the restraints on men as well as their liberties are to be reckoned among their rights. But as the liberties and restrictions vary with time and circumstance, the advent of infinite modifications, they cannot be settled upon by any abstract rule, and nothing is so foolish as to discuss them upon that principle. Here again, we get a confirmation of the idea that we have a right to be restrained, but it puts it alongside the comment in the last, as quoted in the last section, that men cannot enjoy rights of civil and uncivil society simultaneously. Namely, it says that the government is made independently of natural rights, and that liberties, which can be circumstantial, cannot be discussed based on those abstract principles that natural right reasoning offers. This implies that whether or not we possess some natural rights, this is not what is relevant to the practice of government. We enter into civil society for our own betterment, and it is this betterment that is our right, and we can only actually benefit from it by looking at the practical situation at hand. It is thus this what our government should do and should care about when dealing with political issues, as the government is a contrivance of human wisdom for human want. Real politics is too messy, too circumstantial, too engaged in making compromises, in caring for us, that it is no use in dealing with abstract principles when doing so, where their abstract clarity is their practical deficiency. Note that what Burke does here is not so much create a theoretical refutation of natural rights or any conception of it, but rather that he says that they do not matter, as you cannot enjoy civil and uncivil rights simultaneously. Also, a refutation of a specific conception of natural rights would require a comprehensive theory of what politics is, and as said before, Burke is skeptical of the very possibility of such theory being actually informative. His main point then is that it's wrong to ask questions or deliberate upon rights of individuals based upon these abstract principles. It is in this regard that you can also read the comment on page 612 of your book, in which he says that if you have a question about food or medicine, you would pose them to a farmer or a doctor respectively, not to a metaphysician. Even though some parts here sound Lockean, like not being a judge in your own case, they are not exactly that. Note that for Locke we give up our natural rights in a conditional way. For Burke, if we would even have natural rights, we give them up in an absolute sense. This might has a Hobbesian flavor, but also falls short of Hobbes' account, because even in Hobbes, we give it up with a very small conditionality. The condition being that we can always resist the authority the moment that it cannot guarantee our freedom, our safety, our bodily integrity. All other freedoms besides that we give up. So there's still a very small notion of conditionality in there. Where in Burke, actually, he does not even consider this. When you make the transition into civil society, there is no going back. The metaphor of the social contract is not abandoned, and it's still there, but it's changed into an indissoluble contract. So, that Burke views a society as a social contract becomes evidence from the next passage we will discuss. However, we will see that his conception of what a social contract is quite different from the two that we've discussed above, or if we even would include Rousseau. So what does Burke have to say on this? He says, society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interests may be dissolved at pleasure, but the state ought not to be considered as such, as nothing better than a partnership agreement in the trade of paper and coffee, collio or tobacco, or some other such low concern to be taken up for a little temporary interest, and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is looked upon with other reverence, because it is not a partnership in a thing subservient only to gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher nature, connecting the visible and the invisible world, according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath, which holds all physical and all moral natures, each in their appropriate place. The municipal corporation of that universal kingdom are not morally at liberty to at their pleasure, and on the speculation of a contingent improvement, wholly to separate and tear assured the bonds of their subordinate community. and to dissolve it into an unsocial, uncivil, unconnected chaos of elementary principles. So that was a very long passage, but the biggest difference between the other social contract theorists and Burke is, and arguably Burke's most famous sentence, is that the contract is not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. This is for the reason that the state and the community are a higher entity than just the material prosperity of a society, and therefore needs to be treated other than those contracts. It's an engagement in all sciences, all arts, and it will take many a generation to actually conclude this project. That's why all members or all generations are member to the pact. Meaning that we have to treat it carefully so that everybody can get their due share of that. That's why nobody is able, or no law can be subjected to limited interest or small-term improvements or the fancies of the parties involved. Burke here makes actually an ingenious argumentative move. He takes one of the major criticisms of the other social contract theorists, faced as the "I did not actually consent to this criticism," and turns it on its head. He asks, who are you to unconsent? What gives you the right to take away this eternally evolving social contract from the people who are not even born yet? The contract pre-existed you. The contract you will predecease it. You don't have the right to undermine it, as any right that you think you might have are actually the product of this contract itself. So the individual is subordinated to the contract, not the other way around, as we find in the other contract theorists. For Burke, obligations come before rights. And here again, we can see a reversal of the Enlightenment idea, where an individual in the Enlightenment period would be at the center of the moral universe. In the Burkean sense, the individual is a subordinate to an inherited community, tradition, and social institutions. So, if we have to sum all of this up together, he seems to be saying, if there was a pre-collective condition, it's not of relevance to us now, because you won't get back to it. And any attempt to try, look across the English Channel, look to France, and see what you're gonna get. So, now we can make sense of this quote that we started out with. The statement that France has not sacrificed her virtue to her interest, but that she has abandoned her interest to prostitute her virtue. First of all, the idea that she abandons her interest is related to the comparative valuation of technical and practical knowledge. The French committed a sin of radically overhauling their whole society based on the abstract rational principle that didn't prove merit in practice. They wanted to move towards those ideals that they should have done it in a more incremental way, because they've overlooked all the practical elements and wisdom that was inherited in their constitution. Therefore, this was bound to go wrong. Right? They make this naive mistake of neglecting practical knowledge. Why can we say that she prostituted her virtues? Well, it's because she violated this eternally evolving social contract, and in that deprived future generations of the treasure that they should have rightfully inherited. And at the same time, the revolutionaries robbed themselves and all of their compatriots from the only entity which could give them rights. They took away all the rights based on the traditions that they had. This seems to me to be the conclusion of Burke's reflection on the French Revolution. So, conservatism isn't really sexy today, especially not among students. However, is this a rightful assessment of the qualities of the theory? Well, today, fundamentalism and ethnic separation, think about Catalonia in Spain or in the Scottish referendum, are all based upon a political resentment of the political project that Enlightenment entails, which is often related to globalization and cultural homogenization. And we see with the increase in globalization there is actually a counter movement in returning to those nationalistic or religious attachments, which is the opposite of what most Enlightenment thinkers thought, or what's the opposite that people, for instance, as Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels predicted, who proclaimed that sectarian identities would disappear with a global movement, or in the later case, a global labor movement. So the opposite is tending to happen. So there must be something to the claim of which Burke here tries to make, that actually the proponents of Enlightenment politics are politically naive. And it's something very interesting to ponder on the extent to which this is true. And with this food for thought, I would want to leave you today. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you next time. Bye bye.